This is a real pleasure. I'll even use the word honor. A lot of you have seen him on TV, you've heard him here, you've admired his work, maybe from a close, certainly from afar. I'm going to call him Bishop Reverend Dr. William Barber. He often just goes by Reverend Barber, but I figured I'd throw in more of the works. He is one of the co-founders of the Poor People's Campaign, also the architect of the Forward Together Moral Movement. His website is breachrepairers.org. We'll be talking about the tour of North Carolina this weekend. Also give us a window to what's happening in North Carolina, and maybe a window to what's happening a little bit beyond. Reverend, how you doing?
Well, I'm doing well. Certainly glad to be on with you. Give Thom my regards. And I am president of Repairers of the Breach, which is the national organization that kind of undergirds part of the work of the Poor People's Campaign. And always glad to come on your show. Thank you for the book you just outlined. One of the things I love about this show, and I tell people, they read. And they always have a footnote. The worst thing you can be is loud and wrong. And so...
No, I appreciate it. It is a difference, right? Like one of the things that we're really like, I say, I learn something on the show every day from a caller. We have a audience that pays attention, that reads, that knows, and makes one another smarter. So I appreciate it. Let's do the plug up top. What do you got cracking that you want to make sure people know about?
Well, starting tonight digitally and then through the course of the weekend in North Carolina, Repairers of the Breach and several other organizations are coming together to have what we call it, if we ever needed to vote, we sure do need to vote now, organizing, mobilizing gatherings in the 14 congressional districts of North Carolina. We start tonight in Goldsboro. We're going tomorrow to Greensboro, and then Wilmington, and then Wilson, and then back to Winston-Salem. And the reason we're doing this is because this is about not personality and people, but about policy. In North Carolina, nearly 50% of the people, 47% of the people in the state are poor and or low wealth, low wage.
Give us the fact again. Give us the fact again.
In North Carolina, over 47% of the population, poor and or low wage or low wealth in this state. That's millions of people. In North Carolina, 47% of the voting population is poor and or low wealth. In North Carolina, if just 19% of poor and low wage and low wealth voters voted who did not vote the last time, not 30%, not for just 19%, that amount of people could outdistance any margin of victory in any of the campaigns we have, from the presidency right down to Congress to county commissions. That's power.
So if you get 1/5 of income-constrained people to vote, who are eligible to vote, just get 1/5 of, a little less than 1/5 of them to vote, it would be a bigger margin than decided any race in the state.
Right, the bigger margin. And the fact of the matter is, what people are facing in this state, we have 1 million people who are uninsured. That's a policy issue. We have 2 million people who work for less than $15 an hour, over 49% of the workforce. That's a policy issue. We just won one of the largest victories of re-enfranchisement of felon voters, for people who are formerly felons. Over 56,000 voters have now been given their rights back. We just won a case a few weeks ago that we started working on years ago that says that an unconstitutionally constituted legislature can't change the Constitution and write statutes that do that. The Supreme Court in North Carolina ruled and now sent it back to the courts. And that's going to allow us to undo a lot of the things that the so-called Republican majority legislature did. My point is that we're saying to people, if you feel like you're not being heard, you must make people hear you. And secondly, the things you're facing are policy. Well, if it's policy that's hurting you, you have to get involved in the way you put people in office who set policy. And the only way you can do that is to be engaged in voting. And most people do not know the power that now poor and low wealth people have. Poor and low wealth people, low wage, are 30% of the electorate nationally and 45% in battleground states. Think about that. And a real quick stat. In North Carolina, it's 19%. In Florida, it's 4%. If you could just get 4% of poor, low wealth, low wage voters who are already eligible, many who are already registered, to vote that didn't vote in 22, they would outdistance any margin of victory. Georgia's 7%. And the numbers are like this. In Michigan, it's 1%. And so what we're saying is high time is past time for poor, low wealth, low wage voters, their moral allies and advocates to say if we ever needed to vote for democracy and justice, we need to vote now. And lastly, we're telling politicians to come to this gathering and shut up and listen, because we'll be having testifiers who are impacted and are going to say they're looking at candidates not based on their party, but based on their policy. And then we're going to have training and mobilization, how people can sign up and do canvassing, do texting, go into communities. But this is real serious mobilization. And then on Tuesday, on the 30th, we are announcing nationally to our 38 coordinating committees throughout the country, states, and our partners that we're going to call for a national, if we ever needed to vote, we should need to vote now. And we're going to touch 5 million voters, 5 million poor, low wealth, and low wage voters around issues across this country, saying it's time for you to make sure that this often unrecognized and unrespected power is respected.
Reverend, let me ask, what's the state of democracy in North Carolina? What are you up against in terms of voter suppression? What are you up against in terms of barriers to register and vote, polling places open or closed, the systems of voting? What are the things, including doing the sort of education, inspirational, organizing work that your effort is doing? What are the sort of levers of democracy that need to be pulled in a way to put fewer barriers in the way of people to participate in the first place?
Well, North Carolina is a little unique, and let me tell this story this way. When we did the Moral Monday movement starting in 2013 and mobilized people to challenge, what people didn't know is we didn't just go to jail and do civil disobedience. We had a legal strategy and we had a voting strategy. Part of our legal and voting strategy was to make sure we turned out voters that would impact state elections, even if we couldn't win the federal one. So we didn't win, for instance, a progressive didn't go into the Senate from North Carolina, but the Supreme Court in North Carolina became progressive, the only one in the South. The appellate court became progressive. More progressive governor was elected. AG was elected. We were able to beat back the supermajority of the extremists who call themselves Republicans. So what that means is in North Carolina, unlike other southern states, they've not been able to push through certain laws because we have veto power in a governor. We also went into the state courts and used the state constitution. So we beat the voter suppression case that they filed in 2013. We beat it in North Carolina. We won. We sent it away. We just won against felony disenfranchisement. We've overturned much of the gerrymandering. We now have a new victory I just told you about. So in some ways, North Carolina is a model for how if you organize in the state and you connect mobilizing and organizing to a legal strategy, a litigation strategy, and a voter registration strategy, you can make it. Now, does that mean everything is hunky-dory? No, because there's still all kinds of tricks, whether it's moving polling places, whether it's an attempt to say to people that they need voter ID when actually they don't need it. But we believe this is the year that North Carolinians can benefit from all of the things the movement won. Same-day registration, early voting, they tried to take that away from us. We held on to it. It was the movement that won those things in 2011. We have more voting rights opportunity in North Carolina than you have, for instance, in New York and other places. So what we need to do now is not have pessimistic resignation. We don't need an ignorant insurrection. What we need is a moral resurrection.
Moral victory, resurrection, I think is what I heard you say. Reverend Barber, thank you so much for being with us. We'll be back in just a moment in the Thom Hartmann Program. So we're talking with them about what they're up to in North Carolina. The question I wanted to ask you before you had to bounce was, you mentioned policy, right? You mentioned talking about health insurance as one way to make clear that to get that 4% or that 7% or that 19% of income constrained, of poor voters to participate, recognize how critical their participation is, and not just to fixate on a presidential race or even a U.S. Senate race, but to recognize what they can do with Supreme Courts, with county clerks, with state legislatures, with attorneys general, with governors, et cetera. What are the mechanisms that you're finding are getting the most traction? Including something that I think we should all take a lesson from, and let me pander for a moment, is you root nearly all of your work in morality, right? You don't merely talk about strategy. You don't merely talk about power. You also talk about morality. What is the right thing to do? And I think you've helped set a tone around the country with connecting, or at least reminding of the connection between basic morality and the policy choices we make. And I will say it's how I became a huge fan. And I hope I'm not too tongue-tied as we talk, because I am one. But operationally, how do you connect that morality? And policy-wise, in addition to those things, what are you doing that's connecting best to try to turn out those voters you're needing to turn out?
Well, I think you have to connect the moral argument. And notice I never say only Christian or only Jewish. The moral argument, whether it's the moral framework of the Constitution, that everybody's supposed to have equal protection under the law, provide for the common good, or whether it's the moral framework that comes out of our deepest religious values. When you connect those to public policy, and you connect that to why you do litigation, why you go to court to fight against policies that undermine the right to vote, why you fight for living wage, why you fight for health care, and you connect that to a deep organizing, going into community, letting indigenous people lead, don't engage in helicopter leadership, building up from the bottom, allowing poor and low wealth people to be the centerpiece of their organizing and in the communities. And then when you add that to massive voter participation and let people know what their power is, and we stop telling some of these lies that are just a part of things people say, like poor and low wealth people vote against their own interests. The truth of the matter is most poor and low wealth people do not vote against their own interests. And many poor and low wealth people do not vote because they never hear policymakers talk to them and actually say the word poverty or low wage. So one of the barriers is we need the political systems and those in office to actually acknowledge poor people and low wage people. We've said to Democrats, listen, when you get a victory, say what the victory is, but don't say what is more than it is. Say, okay, we were able to win this with the structure we have now and the mansion and whatnot. If you give us more of a majority and vote for us, here are the things we'll do. We'll guarantee universal health care for the 87 million people uninsured or underinsured. We'll guarantee a living wage for the 50 million people making less than a living wage and have not seen a minimum wage raised in 12 years. And we'll do it not because it's the Democratic thing to do or the Republican thing to do, because it's the right thing to do. We will make sure that people who were that we call, as you were talking about earlier, who were the essential workers that had to fight during COVID for the rest of us, we'll make sure you have paid family leave. We'll make sure that you take care. And if you do that, then you're not talking about partisan, you're talking about policy. And then lastly, you say to them, bring poor and low wealth people.
Hold on, we'll be right back with you. Stay with us. With Reverend William Barber, talking about the importance of at least a few things. Here are a few principles that I think we're learning from Dr. Barber. You can correct me if I'm getting them wrong, but I'm going to try to offer them to make sure I'm hearing them right. One, the lesson to connect policy choices with morality. Not merely with discussions of power, not merely with discussions of strategy, and not merely of one religious tradition, but whether it's rooted in Christianity or your religion, whether it's rooted in the Constitution itself, just basic human morality, rooting our policy choices in morality. A second principle is being willing to talk about poverty, willing to put policy choices and electoral choices in the context, seen in the context of dealing with low-wage human beings, dealing with poverty, being willing to talk about that.
Centering your policy choices on the poor and low wealth, which is 140 million people, by the way, now in this country. 43% of this country, 52% of our children. They ought to be the center of every policy decision we make. Because if you lift that group, you lift everybody. Yes.
And then a third thing I hear you saying is that asking policymakers when they do something to not say everything is fixed, but to make really clear and say, here's something that has been done. It's better than if we had not done it. And if we can gain a stronger majority, we'll do the next thing. And the next thing is a bigger thing. And then I think you wanted to keep going. So just keep going.
Well, two more things. One, the other is that right now, I think persons, whether Democrats who are interested, they ought to have two more votes at least before the election. Have another vote on living wages. Even if you lose it, let everybody in the country see where people stand on fundamental living wages in the midst of a time where billionaires made $2 trillion during COVID while 8 million more people fell into poverty. Let people see that. Then have another vote on voting rights, the John Lewis bill and all, and let people see, let them vote it down, but let them see. Because what that does is it builds a movement, and a movement can sweep in what you cannot organize in. Movement can change every dynamic when people see clearly. We've even said to the president, this is the perfect time after some of these victories he had to bring a group of poor and low-wage workers from Kentucky, from West Virginia, from Kansas, from North Carolina, a group, along with religious leaders and some economists, go in and then let these poor and low-wage workers and low-wage people come out and speak. Let them have the microphone. Let them say, we are thankful for some steps in the right direction. We've got work to do in this democracy, and we're going to ante up. We're going to engage. We're going to build. We're going to mobilize. But for God's sake, don't leave people untalked about, unspoken of, unseen, and don't try to find just one issue, like one piece of policy that's going to make a difference. They used to say in the civil rights movement, we want all of our rights, not some of them. We have the chance right now to mobilize, as I've said, the 140 million poor and low wealth people in this country. And when I didn't know until we did the data, you're talking about 30% of the electorate.
Yeah.
45%
Reverend, do you know what percentage, what the vote splits on of that 30% of America? Do you know what percentage votes Democrat, what percent votes Republican, what percent doesn't vote at all?
I can tell you this. In the last election, 53% of poor and low wealth voters voted for Biden Harris.
Yeah.
And that's with all the ones that didn't vote.
Yeah.
The truth, our data shows us, and our study proved that most poor and low wage voters vote more progressive when they vote.
Yeah.
That the singular most reason, as we moved around and did this study with scholars and others, was that people said we don't vote because nobody calls our name.
And let me ask this before
nobody comes to Harlan County. Nobody goes down to the Delta. Nobody goes up in West Virginia. And that's a mistake.
Why do you think, we got about a minute, why do you think the politicians are reticent or hesitant, too slow to talk directly to and about poor people in the center, what they're going through? How come?
Well, I think part of it is fear on both sides that people are really going to engage, and that's going to change the status quo.
Yeah.
I think that's and see, if you're a real politician concerned about the country, you got to be willing to mobilize people, even if you may not always be the one getting elected.
Yeah.
And if you have if this block of people come in, Dr. King said in '65, when the masses of poor Negroes and poor white folk come together, they can create a voting bloc that will fundamentally reshape the economic architecture of this nation. Now, you know, and I know that's the greatest fear of aristocracy. Yeah. That's the greatest fear. On either side, that's the greatest fear.
Reverend, before we go to break, plug what you're plugging, plug what you're working on.
Go to Breach Repairers and find out about the congressional tour in North Carolina, and then go to Breach Repair or the Poor People's Campaign and find out about if we ever needed to vote for democracy and justice, we need to vote now to campaign to move 5 million voters, poor and low wealth and low wage in this country between now and the election. Join us in helping us to do that. Reverend
William Barber, you are an American hero. Thanks for spending time with us today.
Thank you, my friend. God bless you.
Be well. This is the Thom Hartmann Program. It's Anything Goes Friday. That's something that went. 202-808-9925.